is John Lundwall, and this presentation is on myth. Well, the title is Myth and Religion, but what it's really about is how ancient civilizations and cultures, without writing, why they created myth, how they passed it down, and what... so the purposes for this conference is, if you're world building, most people, when they write their stories, who's a writer? Yeah, fantasy, science fiction, fantasy. Most people, when they write a world, everyone's literate, and the people who aren't literate still think in literate ways. And the central question that I'm going to be talking about today is, if you did not have any writing at all, or even the concept of writing, how do you pass down your traditions? Now, when we think of traditions, I'm saying, how do you pass down your technology? How do you make a calendar? Because ancient peoples had to know every day of the year. How do you know every day of the year without writing?
Signs of the moons and movement of the stars.
Right. Right. And so then, signs of the moons, movement of the stars. How do you pass that knowledge down without writing?
Stories.
Stories. Okay. Well, we got something here. I have to renew my subscription. Is this an LTUE thing? All right. So. The metaphor that I'm going to be talking about in order to talk about oral cultures, because oral thinking actually has significant different aspects than literate thinking. And as I get into this, you'll see how you'll be able to apply some of these patterns to world building, your science fiction and fantasy. And if you don't see, you're going to learn some really cool stuff anyway. So when a literate person wants to look up an idea, we go to a book. Or an encyclopedia, now we go to the Google, right? Literate societies have canons of knowledge that they pass down. We have a legal canon, we have a literary canon, we have a religious canon, and they're all texts. And that's how we pass down our laws, our traditions, our values, our customs. People without writing don't have any of that. And so we have a good answer. How do you pass down a calendar without writing? Well, you got to be very observant of the stars. Well, how do you pass down other technological aspects without writing, such as how to build a gear turbine to transport your water into the fields? They were doing that in the 3rd millennium BC.
Teach it to your kids.
How do you remember the geometry that you encode in your temples, in your pyramids, in your ziggurats, without writing? So there are certain technical aspects of ancient cultures. And in your world building, you might ask, how do you pass down your magic system without writing? How do you pass down your laws without writing? There's some questions that might build in your world building. Well, I'm going to use a metaphor between literate and oral cultures to show you how oral people pass down information without writing, even technical information. So we literate people, we invented this wonderful thing. Actually, the Chinese first invented the printing press, but we eventually, the Europeans invented this printing press, which was a cloth screw press that they adapted for movable type. And so here you have, okay, so there you have the press itself. You have the screw platform that comes down and presses on to a wood block, which has your letters on it, and eventually they put movable type in there. And you put ink on that block, and you press your paper down on it, and now you can make thousands of pages in a matter of days, whereas before, hand copying, it took years, sometimes, to hand copy one complex text. Claudius Ptolemy's astronomy, there were several copies of that, but every copy had errors because it was a technical text, and the people doing the copying weren't astronomers, right? So it was a mixed bag. All right, so but now you could systemize your copies. That's how literate people do it. Here's how oral people do it. Without writing, without a printing press, first thing oral peoples do is they encode a memory on something they can see. Right? Now, what do you see? Well, you have the geography around you. Mountain, tree, rock, a river, a plant, right? Larry's house. You've got a geography that you are familiar with. And if you want to remember something, you have to encode a memory on that thing. Now, the most ubiquitous thing in nature turns out not to be the land. We have this tradition that all these ancient world peoples were earth-based cultures, and they were... Yes? Oh, am I in front of the...
Not at all.
What do you...
I was answering the question. You were saying the ubiquitous thing, I was saying the sky.
Oh, yes, you're right. What's your name?
Scott.
Scott. The most ubiquitous object in nature is the sky. And so certain stars were formed into constellations. Okay, does anyone know any of the constellations? Right, do any of the constellations look like the thing they're supposed to be?
Nope.
Draco might look like a dragon. Leo might look like a lion.
Closest I've seen is a little...
But from there, it's just a mixed bag, right? Virgo, the largest constellation in the sky, is supposed to be this beautiful goddess. I've spent years looking at it, and I've never seen a beautiful goddess. I have quite the imagination for that. But it's not there. The constellations weren't formed because they looked like things. The constellations were formed from a certain memory the people wanted to recall. They imposed it on those stars and made the stars look like the thing they wanted to remember. So it has nothing to do with the actual visual reference. So the press itself is actually the landscape. That's the thing you're going to encode memories on. This is how world peoples do it. Then you're going to tell a story about the thing you want to remember. And it's not going to be a technical story, right? Because you can't remember that. Who can remember the lecture from their physics class last week? No one can remember the lecture from their physics class last week. I expect you to remember most of this lecture. But if you tell a story filled with outsized characters, outsized events, outsized opponents or monsters, it turns out that's easily remembered. The oral mind will create these rich, odd stories as a way to reinforce memory. This is really the origin of myth. So you're going to tell a story, and now mind you, that story is going to be associated with the thing you observe in the landscape. Right? So we're going to talk about this here in a little bit. And then you're going to repeat that story using actions. All oral societies are play-acting societies. They perform their myths. So there is song. The myths weren't books that you sat down and read, and they weren't lectures that you sat down and listened to. They were songs, they were dances, they were chants. Right? You came together in a community. They were plays, they were dramas. And you watched the myth being performed, or you participated in the myth being performed. Now, what's the advantage of performing your story?
It helps you to remember it.
That's right.
Kinesthetic. It's kinesthetic. You remember by motion.
Well, hi there, neighbor. He's my neighbor. I disavow anything I say in this room. All right? Okay. Right. So oral peoples are actually taking the memory they want to remember, and they layer it in different mediums. So you have a natural object that you're going to encode a memory on. And that natural object is going to be related to the memory. If you want to remember something about your value of life, death, and rebirth, you're going to point to a tree which resembles in its seasons the life cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And that symbol is then going to have a story associated about life, death, and rebirth. And then you're going to perform it. Right? You're creating a memory theater, which is the oral printing press. And then the last thing that they use is a performance context. So you just don't perform these stories anywhere. There's a special place, the temnos, the sacred space, the temple. Could be a stone building, could be standing stones, could be a tree, could be a cave, could be a lake. But wherever it is, it turns out to represent the cosmos of that society. And that's where they perform and tell their stories. Okay, so we're going to go through here. Maybe. Bless you.
Thank you.
Well, here we go. All right, so we're going to delve a little deeper. It turns out in oral societies, your myths weren't campfire stories. You didn't sit around the campfire and tell them whenever you wanted. Almost in all oral societies, the myths were associated with the specific season in the year because they were associated with a specific star in the sky. You only told that story when that star appeared on the horizon, generally with the sun or with the phase of the moon, but the heliacal rising with the sun, heliacal setting with the sun in the west. They watched for that specific time in the year, and that's when they would tell and perform that story. Right? There were huge taboos for telling stories outside of their seasonal cycle, including death. Right? Why would you do that? Any thoughts?
Well, it would certainly make that story mean more. Like, I mean, if you can only do it at this time of the year, like, then it becomes an important thing.
Right? So meaning, yes?
Getting confused with you're telling a story without the star in the sky.
Well, you've got so many stories, it turns out, you need a card catalog. And your card catalog is the stars, right? And you only tell the story when that card flips up.
So it's kind of like Netflix now?
Yes, except you can't binge watch the sky. Well, I guess you can all night in the cold.
Netflix.
Yes. Did you have a question?
No, it's just...
Okay.
I had a comment.
Yes.
Well, the biggest thing I think was not forgetting the story, not corrupting it, because over time, if stories are told by people who did not tell it correctly, did not tell it in the proper order, did not tell it anything, it will be corrupted. And many stories have, many different religions, many different people have very, very similar stories, and I think that's part of it.
That is right. So it is a way to stabilize. Look, the only way to permanently imprint a memory is in fixed print. Right? Writing changes everything. And writing was invented in the late 4th millennium BC, but people still operated in the oral framework for 2,000 years, even with writing. If you go to Egypt, all the writing on the temple walls are actually shorthand for a ritual cycle associated with certain cosmological features, right? It's still part of what we're talking about. People did not develop fully literate consciousness until rather late. We have this thing called the Greek Revolution, classical Greece. This is where science starts. Well, this is where science starts, quote unquote, because this is really the first full literate civilization. And they're finally writing and speaking in ways we understand. Before that, everything has a garment of myth around it, and we think it's just gibberish. And we don't suspect that actually, those pyramids and those ziggurats and those waterways didn't build themselves. And there is geometry in them, there is physics in them, there is weights and measures in them, and they had to do that. And they're all, by the way, many of them are aligned to the stars, or to the cardinal directions. They had to do that with no writing, right? With
The Egyptians had writings, the Sumerians had
Yes.
writings.
And actually, the complexity of buildings, pyramids, and ziggurats starts to increase after the invention of writing. So that is at least a clue that writing helps develop this. But when you look at like the stretching of the cord ceremony, and so we do have some hieroglyphs of the Egyptians building their temples. It's called the stretching of the cord ceremony. You got a couple gods, Sekhmet and Hunefu. They show up with their rituals and incantations, and modern scientists look at it and kind of laugh because there's no technical blueprints. There's nothing as part of that writing. It's all mythological. And yet, with that, they built the Great Pyramid. Which tells us what? It tells us there's a layer to this writing that we do not understand. It's embedded in their oral culture, part of an older tradition of transmitting knowledge. Okay, my clicker is not working. So, let's see, how do I...
Your arrow key should work.
I'm going to have to do this manually. All right, well, that's okay. It's been that kind of day. All right. Very often oral cultures, stories are told. Yeah, I already went over that. All right, so you wait for a certain star to rise in the sky. That's a way to regulate your knowledge, right? So you don't mix it up. As this young lady said, that you don't want to corrupt your memory theater, so everything has to be organized. So you tell the story on a specific day, and that's associated with a certain season. And you don't tell it any other day, okay? Now you're going to perform that story with a ritual. So almost very often, ancient mythologies are connected with ancient rituals. Here's the problem. None of the rituals have survived. Right? So when we go and look at ancient myths, generally we're reading texts from someone who recorded a tradition. But all the other layers of the memory theater, the cosmology, the rituals, that's all dried up and gone away. So then it becomes almost impossible to interpret myth outside of that context. But they're going to perform that on the specific day, and then that all gets performed within a space that represents the things they want to remember. So the mythic canon, the oral imprinting press then has those four layers. The sky and the ground, but it's myth is saturated with astronomical motifs, and you have to ask why. Well, almost always it's because that's how they regulate the entire memory theater, right? So then a story is associated, you perform the story, and that's all done within a space that actually has encoded in it, either with art or symbols or the alignments, the cosmology, the myth, and the ritual. So they're layering this all together. So that's kind of abstract. I'm going to give you now a specific example of how this works. And the only reason why we know this, in the early 1900s, one of the last Lakota are the Native American North Plains Indians, right? And they're on reservations in the early 1900s. One of the last medicine men talked to a Western anthropologist and said, to my knowledge, I'm the only one in my tribe who knows this. And before I die, I'm going to tell you this. In other words, we get what I'm about to talk to by complete accident, right? Because it was never written down, it was never recorded. And it's funny because we had the exact same thing happen in Africa amongst the Dogon tribe. There's this great book called Conversations with Ogotamele, who was the last medicine man of the Dogon. And he pulls aside a French anthropologist and says, to my knowledge, I am the last one who knows this. I'm going to tell you before I die. And ironically, both the Dogon in Africa and the medicine men of the Lakota, what they tell the anthropologist is remarkably similar in the way their culture functioned. All right, so here's what we learned. The Lakota would build winter camp and stay the winter. Now, in all of our textbooks, when winter ended, the Lakota broke camp and were told that they followed the game and the herds and the new growing berries and plants. They followed the food supply as they migrated through the North Plains. Well, the Lakota medicine men said, no, that's not what we did. They broke winter camp and they followed the sun from a constellation which represented the winter camp. And as the stars moved, the sun entered a new Lakota constellation, and as the constellation moved out, representing winter, moved out, and the spring constellation moved in, they broke camp, and they went to a different camp in the Black Hills, and that camp represented the spring constellation. And they arrived at that camp when the sun entered that spring constellation. And then, what did they do at their spring camp? They had a ritual festival. They celebrated spring. They told stories. They had dances. They had rituals, right? All within their sacred teepee. And then, when the Lakota constellation of spring moved out, and the Lakota constellation of summer moved in, they broke camp, and they followed the sun to another camp in the Black Hills, which represented the constellation of summer. In other words, here's what they're doing, and this is fascinating. All the Lakota constellations had a corresponding camp. Follow? Right? So, as the sun moved through the constellations, the Lakota moved through the camps. Okay? Now, one of the advantages of this is you have just put your entire land geography where? In the sky. So you can recall your entire land, the map of the world, by doing what? Looking at the sky. Right? Which means, during the day, when you can't see the stars in the sky, and you're walking on the land, what can you recall? The stars associated with the land. They married the two, right? And so, wherever you were at, you had a reference to the sky and vice versa. Now that is pretty ingenious. Well, that's how the oral mind works. Well, so they would break camp in the spring, and they would go to the summer camp, which turns out to have been, do we recognize this thing here? Boy, this is such a terrible image. What?
The Devil's Tower.
That's where the aliens landed and they invented mashed potatoes? Right there. Devil's Tower.
Oh, I know this story.
Yeah, right, thank you. They had music.
Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
What's that?
Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Close Encounters of the Third Kind? That's right. Well, the Lakota wrote that.
It's Bear Claws.
Bear Claws, thank you. Well, it turns out the Devil's Tower, which is what we call it, was called Bear Lodge by the Lakota. And Bear Lodge was actually a constellation. So Devil's Tower was a representation of the constellation. The constellation were formed, you can't see it, I've got this thing here. Yeah, you can't see it. Pollux, Gemini and Castor and Pollux are the stars in that Lakota constellation. And what's really interesting, I got a picture here, they would tell their story of the summer solstice, which involved fallen star, which is their primordial ancestor, their Adam. Right? Fallen star comes from the star world, and he gives the Lakota all their traditions, which they then recite through the year, through myth, ritual, and cosmology.
So that's
right?
the Seven Sisters of Pleiades?
That is the Seven Sisters of Pleiades. You are getting ahead of me. We've got a plant in the audience. But actually, one of the chief stories they told here was about a brother and sister, two of the first Lakota, who came to Devil's Tower chased by bears, and they ascended into heaven with the help of Fallen Star, and the bears, of course, are clawing at the mountain, and that's why the mountain looks the way it does. I find that to be, that's all we really know about that story. It's where the Lakota soul enters heaven, right? And they enter heaven through the Lakota constellation Bear Lodge, which is Castor and Pollux. I find that interesting because over here in the old world, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the gate of the soul to the next world is in the same part of the sky.
According to Babylon, aliens came from the Pleiades and brought them technology.
Thank you for bringing us into LTUE. That's right. Aliens. Yes, this is the origin. Well, it's close encounter of the third kind. All right. Well, just so I don't know how to go back.
Back arrow,
What is it?
left arrow key,
Left arrow, right.
Oh, yep. Thank you.
and right arrow key goes the other way.
All right. So just so that we complete the circuit. Next time. Here we have a teepee, and this is a ritual teepee right here. Now it turns out these teepees were actually models of their cosmos. Very often they were built with 28 sticks, one stick for each lunar day, right? They had symbols on the outside. You can't see, but they have cosmological symbols which actually are encoding their cosmology. So they enter the teepee, which is a model of their cosmos, which they're walking through as they journey through their journey. And this is where they sit and they tell their story and perform their ritual. One of the chief rituals is the peace pipe ritual, and we see that in movies everywhere, right? They sit down with the white man, they share a peace pipe. And well, with the Lakota, the pipe represented a constellation, the Big Dipper. Right? The eternal stars in the sky that never set. Right? The coal that they used to lit the pipe was the sun. And every aspect of the ritual had a cosmological connection. Now, why did they do that? Here you have no writing, right? So when we make a contract, what do? We hire a lawyer, right? They go and they sit and they write all this text about all the evil things that will happen to you if you break the contract. And then they write all the exceptions that they never tell anyone. and so we get these stacks of contracts. That's how we make our promises, right? Well, you don't have that in oral culture. So you're going to make your promises and oaths based off eternal archetypes, the things that never change. And so their peace pipe ceremony is all rooted in the stars that never set. That is my honor and my word, is the eternal you see every night. So it is rather elegant. All right, so to summarize, and then I'm going to take a few questions and I'm going to give another example. The printing press for the Lakota was following the sun into the sacred constellations of the tribe. Right? The paper for the Lakota was the myth and song. They would recite the creation stories and stories of fallen star in their different camps. The ink for the Lakota was the ritual and dance, which they would perform as they arrived in each camp. And the binding was the teepee and landscape. Various camps were representations of constellations, which means the constellations were representations of camps. One could see the sky world on the ground and read a land map by looking in the sky. Fertility, hunting, technology, calendar, cultural laws and norms, mapping, esoteric cosmology, religion, philosophy, all of that's encoded in this. That is how the entire tribe learned the tradition as they went through all those steps. All right. Any questions? Yes?
Isn't it that a lot of these traditions, oral traditions, are lost to different parties? For instance, a lot of Native Americans and the Americans trying to take away their language and culture as they assimilated them.
Yes. The question is, do these traditions get lost through warring cultures? And the answer is yes. Your oral memory theater is only as good as the people who remember it and keep it up. Now, in the ancient world, that was generally your temple priests. A little later, temple priestesses. There's evidence actually a lot earlier as temple priestesses. But your priests and priestesses would keep the oral memory theater, right? And then when you were invaded and your temple was sacked and all your priests and priestesses were killed, that's the equivalency of burning down the Library of Alexandria. You lose so much. So it is delicate. And that means that meanings change. Because if you lose a certain aspect or interpretation of your ritual and myth through warfare, through death, through plague, sickness, whatever, the new guy has to, or girl, has to come in and try to reconstitute it, right? Look, from the very first dynasty in Egypt, 3000 BC, they already knew that they didn't know the meaning of most of their religion. They were always looking back, trying to reinterpret, right? So when writing is finally developed, they've already admitted, yeah, this isn't quite right. Okay, so that's sobering, yes?
So it sounds like part of what you're describing is less an encoding of information than an aid to memory. So the example that you're giving about the villages and the different villages and things, there's the reminder that you go to the camp at this different time, but the knowledge of where the camp is, it sounds like from what you're saying is not embedded in the text. That's embedded in the people who then use that to help call that knowledge out. Is that
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
The culture is constructed around mnemonics. Of course, they would never say that.
right?
But everything has to be remembered. And so the entire ritual festival, all oral cultures have ritual cycles. And we think it's so bizarre. They have their New Year's festival where in the ancient world, the entire city-state would show up for the New Year's festival and practice, right? They would ring dance around the city, bring out and carry an image of the god, and we think it's also silly and primitive, but it's necessary for the oral world to transmit the tradition, because you don't have writing. And so again, they did have writing from 3200 BCE to on, but again, for over 2,000 years, they're still operating with one foot in the oral tradition. Yes?
Does that mean that the Bible is better read as a recording of oral text?
Well, yes. Now, I should actually step back and say, everything I'm saying has another academic arguing against it. Okay? That's the world of academia. So, and part of the problem in talking about this is we're talking about the oral world. Right? So we have to interpret the few written puzzle pieces that are left and project backwards. Right? Let's see. Is my next example out of the Bible? Oh, it is. Okay. So, for that I need some notes. Here is.
You don't have it all in your oral, your memory, your aids to memory.
My mind is a infertile field.
This is not
barren.
This is not the temple where he performs that ritual.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for bailing me out. This is not the correct time. The only time it is right now in my ritual cycle is to take a drink of the dew. Yes.
As I write scripts and I thought about creating civilizations, in looking at Earth, there is not a single major civilization that has ever developed that does not have some kind of religion. Even if it's communism for Russia, that took the place of religion. But every one of them has some kind of folklore, they have some kind of gods, they have something that they look up to.
Let me give you a thunderbolt. There is no ancient civilization that has a word for religion. If you don't have a word for it, I believe you don't have a concept of it.
Well, they had gods.
Well, no, okay, we're imposing our ideas of religion. What I'm telling you, this whole mythic canon, with the cosmology, the stories, the rituals, that's what we call their religion. They wouldn't call it religion. They would just call it reality. This is life. They did not separate secular from religious, or scientific from philosophical. It either existed or it didn't. It either was or it was not.
But it influenced the way they lived and what they did.
It influenced everything the way they lived, right? All the way up until Christianity cultures, at least from 0 BCE to 3000, probably 4000 BCE, their ideal was to mimic nature around them, the cosmos around them, right? And so they weren't, I mean, that was, I don't want to go down this road. When Plato writes about the ideal city in the Republic, right? He starts talking about, well, we need philosophers, but let's kick out the mythologists. I'm not there. We need poets, but we need the good tyrants, but not the bad tyrants. But after a while, he starts saying, well, there's still so many problems. And so then the second half of the Republic is all cosmology. The city has to be built after the eternal order of the stars, which is what the Lakota were doing with their peace pipe ceremony. Right? So oral cultures are trying to mimic the eternal and the land and sky in their cultural patterns. That is their religion. But they wouldn't call that religion. Religio is a Roman word which was used for the cult, the state cult, right? The state. There was no separation between church and state. Right? The state was the church was the state, the university was the church was the university. This was true all the way through the Middle Ages. When we're told that Galileo was fighting against the church, well, no, actually he wasn't. He was fighting against the university. Because the priests that were arguing with Galileo were the professors. And they were arguing the science of the day. Right? So there is no separation between church and state. This starts to happen in the first century with Christianity, when the first literate Christian writers start using the word religion. This is a parenthetical I did not want to go down. I am so sorry. But when they first started to use the word religion as a way to demarcate their beliefs from everyone else's. The Christian religion is the true one. You guys have stuff. Okay? That's when the word religion started to be used in the context we start recognizing it in. And then it turns into what we recognize it as actually centuries later during the humanism and the rise of secularism. Now religion is used as something other than secularism or science. But there was never any separation between science and religion for 99.9999999% of human history. Right? This is a brand new radical idea. And I am with whoever mentioned it. It's a faulty one. All right, where am I? Well, why did we go there? Why is it so hot?
Fires of hell.
Fires, yeah. Well, I'm about to jump into them. All right. So here's another example. I don't have time. See, well, it's fun. Here's another example. I'll go over it real quick. You have a creation story in Genesis chapter 1, right? Interestingly, in Exodus chapter 40, you have the New Year's ritual of the Israelites. This is when they set up their temple tent, the tabernacle, okay? Just like the Lakota teepee, right? Now, it's interesting, as you go through Exodus 40, the way they set up the temple has a curious resonance with the creation story in Genesis 1. They lay out the foundation of the temple. God lays out the foundation of the world. Fiat lux, let there be light. They set a divider between the Holy of Holies and the Hekal. God separates the water above from the water below, right? They put in the shewbread tables of the agriculture. God puts plants on the earth. They bring in they bring in the lampstand to light the temple. God creates the sun and moon. They perform animal sacrifices. Day 5, God creates the animals. The priest enters the Holy of Holies. Day 6, God creates man. Yahweh descends into his temple. Day of rest. Right? So the entire construction of the temple has a curious parallel with the days of creation. So now the question is, what is the creation story about? If it descends from oral traditions, does it descend from oral traditions? Yes. If it descends from oral traditions, it's going to have cosmology, myth, ritual, and temple associated. right? The temple text is not a scientific document that tells us how God actually made the earth. It is an echo of the ritual cycle of the Israelites as they set up their temple and perform their memory theater. Okay, now, how many Sunday school teachers would disagree with me?
Probably quite a few.
Probably quite a few, but this is my academic stance. Okay? All right. It is 1:45. What I wanted to say, look, if you're writing a story, I'm done. 2 minutes? 3?
7.
No, I was just gonna say I can get you like a white screen in here.
A white screen?
You know, the kind you're supposed to have.
Oh, no, I'm done.
That'd be great.
It's too late.
Talk, though.
You could get me a Mountain Dew. Okay. Right.
I would love one for the next one.
All right, so here's the point. If you're writing a story, actually the point has been all 45 minutes. It's been wonderful, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Greatest thing you've ever heard today in the last 45 minutes. If you're writing a story and you have a mythic culture, a fantasy land, there are some considerations that you may want to consider. What mythology are you building in your world, and is it intellectually consistent? Are the gods and goddesses associated with something on the land or in the sky? Is there a story you've created about that? Is there a ritual associated with it? Right? Is there a specific performance context where they are delivering this information? Is there a specific temple or palace in your story where some of this has to happen? Is your magic system involved in this? The point is once you kind of understand this template, when you start creating your worlds, there is much rich, fertile soil to start working with as you start world building, right? You can start linking some of these things in your world. All right, so that was my LTUE pitch. Any questions? Yes?
Petroglyphs and pictographs, since we're in Utah, they're
Yes.
all over the place. Which would you consider that? Would you consider that like the constellations that they put on rock,
I don't know. We don't know the interpretation. I actually attended a fascinating lecture about the Parowan Gap petroglyphs. And the guy who gave that lecture gave a pretty convincing argument that it was a Venus calendar. So he had his circumstantial evidence piled up. But the bottom line is petroglyphs are an alphabet without a context. So I would link it to this mythic canon. They're associated with how they're transmitting their knowledge. And the oral mind is going to layer this. They're going to have a story associated with the petroglyph. They're going to have a ritual associated with it. It's all gone.
A memory jog.
A memory theater.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Any other questions? Someone? Yes.
And basically, the one thing that I am wondering is that when you are constructing your stories and your myths and your religions and your things for your own world, how much do you borrow from real world mythology and how much do you make up on your own?
Well, that's up to you. I say steal it all. Listen, if you adopt previous systems and then tweak them for your world, that's that's what they've been doing. That's what these people were doing for thousands of years. Hamlet is based off a Norse folktale. And Harry Potter is filled. J.K. Rowling knew her Greek myth. Right? And Lord of the Rings, again, Germanic. If you read the Silmarillion. Who's read the Silmarillion? You are nerds. And I salute you. Again, a lot of that is directly taken from prior mythic material. Any other questions?
This man down here.
Yes? Yes.
So what do you say would happen if, say, your oral tradition society had like larger settlements, and then maybe you had more than one shaman or more than one medicine man, and they probably disagreed with each other all the time, especially if that medicine man, shaman status is based on if they're mages or not.
That's right. So this is where poison was invented. They started with psychotropic drugs, and they moved to poison. There's legitimacy to what you're saying, because as civilizations get more complex, they get corporatized. And then you have basically dueling priesthoods. This is the whole Akhenaten thing where Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh, wanted to go to monotheism, and he surrounded himself with a priesthood who supported this new ideology, a new interpretation of the canon they had been passing down for thousands of years. And the old priesthood didn't like it, and so eventually it did come to blows. So this happens. You've got knowledge lost through war. You've got knowledge lost through sickness and famine, through migration. You've got knowledge lost through politics and competing shamans. I mean, we want to make them all these romantic, all these people who are so spiritual and they're linked with the landscape of the earth. Well, you know, some of them probably were, and the other ones were skinning in human sacrifices. So, yeah, you're right. And that makes great grist for a fantasy novel, doesn't it? Oh, and for history. Yes, last question, because, oh, maybe one more, yes.
So it seems like most of what we have here is from pre-literate nomadic societies, but I mean, you wouldn't have the same associations with specific landmarks, I would think, if you're already an agricultural society. Right?
No, incorrect. Let me just address that real quick. Almost every land feature in ancient Mesopotamia had a celestial archetype. The river Tigris was associated with the constellation. The Euphrates was associated with the constellation. Every city was associated with the constellation. And the temples in the city were associated with certain stars. In Egypt, they had 42 nomes, N-O-M-E-S, like villages, right? Those 42 nomes corresponded to the 42 judges in the land of the dead, which corresponded to 42 areas in the afterlife, all of which was in the sky, by the way, right? So they built their book of the dead and their cosmology in the buildings and in the nomes on the ground.
My question then is, if I would guess that most of the people stay in their specific center, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so they're not as familiar with the lands outside of their specific center.
Yes.
And I guess, is it just that only the priestly class knows enough about the land to fully associate it?
We are going to end on this question. That is a great question. And my answer to this is, in every epoch, in every age, including our own, there is only a small, minute people who are actually willing to be intellectually curious enough to go and explore what's beyond their traditions or their own traditions. Most people just take what is given to them, right? And that is true universally. That's true today. Just turn on the TV, right? And that was true yesterday, right? Most people in the ancient world really didn't know all that was beyond. This is why the medicine men of Lakota was saying, look, this is gone. My people have dropped it. I've got to give it to you, right? So most people had to, well, actually half of them were slaves and the other half were managing the slaves, and they were just trying to build their food supply, right? In the words of Tacitus, the ancient world is toil, toil, toil. But the priestly class, or the shaman class, or the people in charge of the knowledge, they were in charge of it. They were the ones that passed it down from generation to generation. And the more complex the civilization began, the more that began to spread out, right? Actually, the rise of the middle class merchants actually helped spread knowledge and education of this. in some ways. So anyway, that's it. Our time is up. Thank you so much.